Marcus Rivera sat at the long wooden table in the music room. His fingers drummed against the surface as he looked at his watch for the 10th time in 5 minutes. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he had been listening to young musicians play violin for 3 hours straight. The auditions for the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra were supposed to be exciting. They were supposed to help him find the next great talent. Instead, Marcus felt tired and disappointed. The music director was 52 years old and had been working with young musicians for 20 years. He had heard thousands of children play violin, piano, and other instruments. Some were good, some were terrible, but very few were truly special. Today felt like one of those days where nobody would surprise him. Marcus wore his usual dark suit and tie. His gray hair was perfectly combed and his shoes were polished to a shine. Everything about him said professional and serious. The parents who brought their children to auditions always seemed nervous around him. Maybe it was because he rarely smiled during auditions. Maybe it was because he had a reputation for being very picky about who could join his orchestra. The Metropolitan Youth Orchestra was not just any music group. It was one of the best youth orchestras in the country. Every year they performed at Carnegie Hall in New York City. Famous musicians had once played in this orchestra when they were young. Getting accepted was like winning a prize. It could change a young person's life forever. Sarah Mills, Marcus's assistant, sat next to him at the table. She was 28 years old and had been working with Marcus for 3 years. Sarah had studied music in college and understood how difficult it was to find real talent. She took notes on every student who auditioned. She also prepared rejection letters for those who did not make it into the orchestra. The audition room was large and bright. Tall windows let in the afternoon sunlight. A grand piano sat in one corner, its black surface reflecting the light. Music stands were arranged neatly around the room. The walls were covered with pictures of famous musicians and past orchestra performances. The room was designed to make young musicians feel important, like they were already part of something special. But Marcus was not feeling the magic today. The morning had started with promise. A 13-year-old girl from the private music academy had played a Mozart piece beautifully. She had clearly practiced for months. Her technique was perfect and she never missed a note. But something was missing. There was no soul in her playing. It sounded like she was reading from a book instead of telling a story with her music. After her came a boy who had been taking violin lessons since he was 4 years old. His parents had spent thousands of dollars on private teachers and expensive instruments. The boy played well, but Marcus could tell he did not really love music. He was only there because his parents wanted him to be there. His playing was correct but cold. Then came twins who both wanted to join the orchestra. They played a duet together and their timing was perfect. But Marcus had seen this before. Rich families who could afford the best teachers and instruments. Children who looked perfect on paper but had never struggled for anything in their lives. Their music was clean and proper, but it did not move him. By lunchtime, Marcus had heard 15 young musicians. None of them had given him goosebumps. None of them had made him lean forward in his chair with excitement. He was starting to wonder if this generation of young people had forgotten how to feel music in their hearts. Sarah noticed that Marcus seemed frustrated. She tried to cheer him up during their lunch break. "Maybe this afternoon will be better," she said as they ate sandwiches in his office. "We still have 12 more auditions to go." Marcus shook his head. "I feel like I'm listening to robots play music," he said. "They all sound the same. Perfect technique, but no heart. No passion. I'm starting to think we should just pick the 3 best players and be done with it." But Sarah knew that Marcus was a perfectionist. He would never settle for good enough when it came to his orchestra. She had seen him turn down students who played beautifully because they did not have that special something he was looking for. She had also seen him cry when a truly gifted young person played music that touched his soul. The afternoon auditions began at 1:30. A 14-year-old boy played a piece by Bach. His playing was clean and precise, but Marcus found himself thinking about what he would have for dinner. A 15-year-old girl played a beautiful melody by Vivaldi. Her bow work was excellent, but Marcus started organizing his papers while she played. By 3 o'clock, Marcus was ready to go home. He had heard 8 more students since lunch, and none of them had impressed him. They were all technically good, but that was not enough for the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra. He wanted musicians who could make people forget where they were when they played. He wanted young people who understood that music was not just about hitting the right notes at the right time. Sarah looked at her list. "We have 4 more auditions today," she said. "Then we can call it a day." Marcus nodded and straightened his tie. He tried to look interested and professional, even though he felt disappointed. The parents and students who were waiting deserved his full attention, even if he doubted any of them would surprise him. That was when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside the audition room. They were different from the confident steps of the other students and parents. These footsteps were slower, more careful. They squeaked slightly against the polished floor. Marcus looked toward the door, wondering who would be next. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever. He had no idea that in just a few minutes he would meet a young person who would remind him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. The door handle turned slowly, and Marcus prepared himself for another disappointing audition. He picked up his pen and got ready to take notes. Outside, the afternoon sun was still shining through the tall windows. Inside, everything was about to change. The door opened slowly, and a small figure stepped into the audition room. Marcus looked up from his papers and saw a boy who could not have been more than 12 years old. The child was thin and shorter than most kids his age. His black hair was neatly combed, but his clothes told a different story. The boy wore an old sweater that was too big for him. The sleeves hung past his hands, and he had to push them up to his elbows. His jeans had been washed so many times that they looked faded and soft. His sneakers were white once, but now they were gray with age and use. When he walked across the room, the rubber soles squeaked against the shiny floor. But what caught Marcus's attention most was the violin case the boy carried. It was black and looked very old. Strips of silver duct tape held it together in several places. One corner was dented as if it had been dropped many times. The handle was wrapped in more tape where the original leather had worn away. Marcus felt his heart sink a little. In his 20 years of directing the orchestra, he had learned that expensive instruments usually meant good training. Parents who could afford beautiful violins usually could also afford the best teachers. This boy's case looked like it came from a second-hand store. Sarah noticed the boy's appearance too. She had already started typing on her tablet, preparing the standard rejection letter they sent to students who did not make it into the orchestra. She had done this so many times that she could type it without thinking. "Thank you for your interest in the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra. While your audition showed promise, we have decided to go with other candidates this year. Please consider auditioning again next year." The boy walked to the center of the room where a music stand waited for him. He moved carefully as if he was trying not to make too much noise. His eyes looked around the room, taking in the pictures of famous musicians and the grand piano. He seemed nervous but not scared. Marcus studied the child's face. The boy had dark eyes that seemed older than his years. There was something serious about him, something that made Marcus think he had seen more of life than most children his age. But Marcus had learned not to let sympathy cloud his judgment. The Metropolitan Youth Orchestra was not a charity. It was a place for the most talented young musicians in the country. "What is your name?" Marcus asked, his voice formal and businesslike. "Jamie Chen," the boy replied quietly. His voice was soft but clear. He did not have the confident tone that most of the other audition candidates had used. Those children had been trained by their parents and teachers to speak up and sell themselves. Jamie just answered the question simply and honestly. Marcus wrote the name at the top of his evaluation sheet. "How old are you, Jamie?" 12, sir. "How long have you been playing violin?" Jamie thought for a moment. "About 6 years, I think." "Maybe 7. Marcus raised his eyebrows. Most of the children who auditioned for his orchestra had been playing since they were 3 or 4 years old. Starting at age 5 or 6 was considered late, but he wrote down the information anyway. Sarah looked up from her tablet and watched as Jamie carefully placed his case on the floor. The boy knelt down and slowly opened the latches. They were old and took some effort to open. When the case finally opened, Marcus could see the inside was lined with faded blue velvet. The fabric was worn thin in some places. Then Jamie lifted out his violin and Marcus had to work hard not to show his disappointment on his face. The instrument was clearly very old and had seen better days. The wood was scratched in many places. Someone had tried to repair some of the damage, but the patches were visible. The strings looked like they had been changed many times, and the bow had been rewrapped with black tape where the original grip had worn away. This was not the kind of instrument that produced beautiful music. Marcus had heard violins worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He had worked with students who played instruments made by master craftsmen centuries ago. Those violins sang with rich, warm tones that could fill a concert hall. Jamie's violin looked like it might fall apart if he played too loudly. Marcus exchanged a quick look with Sarah. She raised her eyebrows slightly, and he knew she was thinking the same thing he was. This audition was probably going to be painful to listen to. They would have to sit through a few minutes of squeaky, out-of-tune playing, then gently tell the boy to try again next year. Jamie stood up and began tuning his violin. Marcus noticed that the boy's hands were steady and sure as he adjusted the strings. That was something, at least. Many nervous students had shaking hands that made tuning difficult. Jamie seemed to know his instrument well, even if it was not a very good one. While Jamie tuned, Marcus thought about the long day of auditions. He was tired and ready to go home. His wife was making his favorite dinner, and he had promised to help their daughter with her homework. The last thing he wanted was to sit through another disappointing performance. Marcus had built his reputation by finding exceptional talent. Over the years, he had discovered several young musicians who had gone on to play with famous orchestras around the world. But those discoveries had become rarer as time went on. Sometimes he wondered if he was getting too old and too picky. Maybe he was expecting too much from children. But then he reminded himself of what the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra represented. These young people would perform at Carnegie Hall. They would play for audiences of thousands of people. They would represent their city and their country on one of the world's most famous stages. They had to be absolutely extraordinary. Jamie finished tuning his violin and looked up at Marcus. "What would you like me to play?" he asked politely. Marcus looked at his list of required audition pieces. Every student was supposed to play one of 3 classical pieces. They were pieces that showed technical skill and musical understanding. Most students chose the easiest one, but even that was quite difficult. "You may play any of the 3 pieces on the audition list," Marcus said. "They are Mozart's Violin Concerto No. 3, Vivaldi's Four Seasons, or Bach's Violin Partita No. 1. Jamie nodded and thought for a moment. Then he said something that surprised Marcus completely. "Actually, sir, I was wondering if I could play something different. Something I choose myself." Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly. In 20 years of conducting auditions, very few students had asked to change the requirements. Usually when they did, it was because they had not prepared properly or because they wanted to show off. Neither reason impressed him. Sarah stopped typing and looked up. She had never heard a student make this request before either. Marcus leaned back in his chair and studied Jamie's face. The boy looked serious and hopeful, but not demanding. He was asking, not insisting, but Marcus believed in rules and standards. The audition pieces were chosen carefully to test specific skills. Letting students play whatever they wanted would make it impossible to compare them fairly. Still, something about Jamie's quiet confidence made Marcus pause. Maybe it was the way the boy stood straight despite his nervous energy. Maybe it was the careful way he had tuned his old violin. Or maybe Marcus was just curious to see what this unusual child would do. The room was very quiet as Marcus considered Jamie's request. Outside the windows, clouds were beginning to cover the afternoon sun. The light in the room grew softer and more golden. Time seemed to slow down as Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Marcus sat back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest. A small smile appeared on his face, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who thought they knew exactly what was about to happen. He had seen this before. Young musicians who thought they were special. Children who believed they could impress him by breaking the rules. In his 20 years as director of the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra, Marcus had developed very strong opinions about young people who thought they knew better than adults. He had worked with students from the most famous music schools in the world. He had heard children play pieces that took professional musicians years to master. These children had been taught by teachers who had studied at places like Juilliard and Curtis Institute. They had instruments that cost more than most people's cars. And now this boy, with his taped-together violin case and his too big sweater, wanted to play something of his own choosing. Marcus found it almost amusing. He had just spent 3 hours listening to carefully prepared auditions by children who had everything money could buy. None of them had impressed him. What made this child think he could do better? Marcus looked at Jamie for a long moment. The boy stood quietly, holding his old violin and waiting for an answer. He did not look arrogant or demanding. He just looked hopeful. But Marcus had learned not to trust Hope. Hope did not make up for lack of training or proper equipment. "Very well," Marcus said finally. His voice was cold and formal. "You want to play something of your own choosing. I suppose I can spare a few minutes to hear what you think will impress me." Sarah looked up from her tablet with surprise. In all the time she had worked with Marcus, she had never heard him speak to a child in such a harsh way. Usually, he was professional but polite with audition candidates. Even when he was disappointed, he tried to be encouraging. But something about Jamie's request had clearly annoyed him. Marcus leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the table. His gray eyes looked directly at Jamie, and his expression was serious and challenging. "Let me tell you something, young man," Marcus continued. "I have been working with talented musicians for more than 20 years. I have heard every piece of violin music worth hearing. I have worked with students who went on to play with the New York Philharmonic and the London Symphony Orchestra. I have discovered young people who now perform solo concerts around the world." Jamie listened quietly, but Marcus could see that his words were having an effect. The boy's shoulders tensed slightly and he gripped his violin a little tighter. Good, Marcus thought. Maybe this would teach him to respect the audition process. "I have worked with students from Juilliard," Marcus went on. "Students from Curtis Institute. Students from the Royal Academy of Music in London. These are schools that only accept the very best young musicians in the world. Their students have access to instruments made by master craftsmen hundreds of years ago. They have teachers who have performed with the greatest orchestras and studied with the greatest masters." Sarah felt uncomfortable listening to Marcus speak this way. She knew he was a demanding teacher, but she had never seen him try to intimidate a child before. Jamie was just 12 years old and he had asked a simple question. He did not deserve to be lectured like this, but Marcus was not finished. He stood up from his chair and walked around the table so that he was standing closer to Jamie. The boy had to look up to meet his eyes. "These students practice for hours every day," Marcus said. "They have been playing violin since they were 3 or 4 years old. They have perfect technique and years of professional training. They understand music theory and composition. They can sight-read pieces they have never seen before." Jamie nodded slightly, but he did not look away or back down. Marcus noticed this and felt even more annoyed. The boy should be intimidated by now. He should be realizing that he was out of his league and asking to play one of the required audition pieces instead. "So tell me," Marcus said, his voice getting sharper, "what makes you think you can walk into my audition room with your damaged instrument and your lack of formal training and play something that will change my mind about what real musical talent looks like?" The room was completely silent. Even the sounds from the hallway seemed to fade away. Sarah held her breath, waiting to see how Jamie would respond. She was ready to step in and defend the boy if Marcus went too far. But Jamie did not crumble under Marcus's harsh words. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked directly into the director's eyes. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "I do not know if I can change your mind, sir," Jamie said. "I only know that music is important to me. It is the most important thing in my life. My grandmother taught me that music is not just about playing the right notes. She said it is about telling a story that comes from your heart." Marcus felt a small flicker of something, but he pushed it away. He was not going to be moved by pretty words from a child. "Your grandmother," Marcus said with a slight sneer. "And I suppose she was a great musician?" "She was," Jamie replied simply. "Before she came to America, she played in concert halls in Europe. She taught me that the violin is not just an instrument, it is a voice. And every voice has something different to say." Marcus laughed, but it was not a pleasant sound. "Concert halls in Europe," he repeated. "How convenient. And I suppose there is no way to verify this story?" Jamie's face flushed slightly, but he did not look away. "You do not have to believe me, sir. You only have to listen." Marcus walked back to his chair and sat down. He picked up his pen and looked at his watch in an exaggerated way. "Fine," he said. "You have exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes to show me what your grandmother's European concert hall training taught you. 3 minutes to prove that you belong in the same room as students who have dedicated their entire lives to music." He paused and looked at Jamie with cold eyes. "But understand this, young man. When those 3 minutes are over, and when you have finished playing whatever piece you think will impress me, I am going to explain to you why technique matters more than stories, why proper training matters more than passion, why expensive instruments matter more than heart." Sarah wanted to say something to stop Marcus from being so cruel, but she knew it would only make things worse. She watched Jamie's face and saw that the boy was not angry or scared. He just looked sad. Not sad for himself, but sad for Marcus. As if he felt sorry for someone who had forgotten why music was beautiful. Jamie raised his violin to his shoulder and positioned his bow. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, something had changed. The nervous, uncertain boy was gone. In his place stood a young musician who knew exactly what he wanted to do. "What piece will you be playing?" Marcus asked, his pen ready to write. Jamie looked at him with calm, serious eyes. "Bach's Chaconne in D minor," he said. Marcus felt his pen slip in his fingers. Sarah's mouth fell open slightly. Even Marcus, with all his criticism and doubts, knew that Jamie had just named one of the most difficult pieces ever written for violin. It was a piece that challenged even professional musicians. Many violinists spent years learning to play it properly. For a moment, Marcus felt a flicker of respect for the boy's ambition. Then he remembered the damaged violin and the duct-taped case. This was going to be a disaster. But at least it would be a quick disaster, and then he could send the boy home and finish his long day of disappointing auditions. Marcus looked at his watch and clicked his pen. "Your 3 minutes start now," he said. Jamie closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The audition room became completely silent. Marcus could hear the faint sound of traffic outside and the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Sarah stopped moving entirely, her hands frozen over her tablet. Even the late afternoon sunlight seemed to pause as it filtered through the tall windows. For a moment, nothing happened. Jamie stood perfectly still with his violin raised to his shoulder and his bow poised above the strings. Marcus glanced at his watch and tapped his pen against the table. He was already preparing the words he would use to explain to the boy why this audition had been a waste of everyone's time. Then Jamie began to play. The first note that came from his old, scratched violin was so pure and clear that Marcus actually looked up from his papers in surprise. It was not the squeaky, uncertain sound he had expected from a damaged instrument. Instead, it was round and full and seemed to fill every corner of the room. Jamie's eyes remained closed as he played the opening phrase of Bach's Chaconne. His bow moved smoothly across the strings, and his left-hand fingers found each note with perfect precision. The melody was simple at first, just a series of notes that introduced the theme of the piece. But there was something in the way Jamie played those simple notes that made them sound important and meaningful. Marcus felt his eyebrows rise slightly. The boy clearly knew the piece well. That was more than Marcus had expected, but knowing a piece and playing it beautifully were two very different things. The Chaconne was more than just difficult music. It was one of the greatest challenges in all of violin literature. It required not just technical skill but deep musical understanding. As Jamie continued to play, the simple theme began to change and grow. Bach had written the Chaconne as a series of variations, with each section becoming more complex than the last. The piece was like a musical journey that started in a quiet place and traveled through storms and sunshine, before returning home again. Jamie seemed to understand this journey perfectly. When the music called for power, his bow pressed deeper into the strings and his sound became bigger and stronger. When the music called for gentleness, he played so softly that Marcus had to lean forward to hear every note. But he never lost the basic rhythm or the underlying harmony that held the entire piece together. Marcus found himself setting down his pen without realizing it. Something strange was happening. The boy was not just playing the notes correctly, he was making them mean something. Each phrase seemed to tell part of a story, and Marcus could almost see the story unfolding in his mind. Sarah had completely forgotten about her tablet. She was staring at Jamie with wide eyes, her mouth slightly open. She had studied music in college and thought she understood what good violin playing sounded like. But she had never heard anything like this from someone so young. As the piece continued, Jamie's playing became more and more complex. The Chaconne demanded that the violinist play multiple melodies at the same time, creating the sound of an entire orchestra with just one instrument. This was the part where most young musicians failed. Even talented students usually could not make all the different musical lines clear and separate, but Jamie made it sound easy. His bow seemed to dance across the strings, bringing out the main melody while also playing the supporting harmonies. The music flowed like water, smooth and natural, as if the violin was singing the piece instead of just playing it. Marcus realized that he was holding his breath. He tried to focus on finding mistakes in Jamie's playing, but he could not find any. The boy's intonation was perfect. His rhythm was steady and strong. His technique was flawless. But more than that, his musical interpretation was mature and sophisticated in a way that seemed impossible for someone his age. The chaconne moved into its most difficult section, where Bach had written passages that seemed to require the violinist to have more than two hands. The music jumped between high notes and low notes, fast runs and sustained melodies, all happening at the same time. Professional violinists sometimes spent months learning to play these passages cleanly. Jamie played them as if he had been born to play them. His fingers flew over the fingerboard, finding every note with accuracy and confidence. His bow arm moved with perfect control, creating dynamics and colors that brought each musical line to life. The old violin in his hands seemed to transform into something magical, producing sounds that Marcus had only heard from the finest instruments in the world. Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had never been moved to cry by a piece of music before, but there was something about Jamie's playing that touched her heart in a way she could not explain. The boy was not just playing notes on a page. He was sharing something deep and personal, something that came from a place of real understanding and feeling. Marcus tried to maintain his professional composure, but he could feel his carefully built walls of skepticism beginning to crumble. This was not what he had expected. This was not what he had prepared himself to hear. This was something extraordinary. The piece moved into a section that was written in a major key, and suddenly the music became bright and joyful. Jamie's playing reflected this change perfectly. His bow bounced lightly on the strings, creating a sound that was full of hope and celebration. But he never let the music become too light or cheerful. He understood that even the happy parts of the chaconne carried weight and meaning. Marcus glanced at his watch and realized that more than 3 minutes had passed. Jamie's time was up, according to the challenge Marcus had issued. But Marcus made no move to stop the performance. He could not bring himself to interrupt something so beautiful and powerful. The music continued to flow from Jamie's violin like a river of sound, each variation built on the one before it, creating a sense of journey and growth. Marcus began to understand why Bach had written this piece. It was not just a technical exercise or a way to show off. It was a meditation on life itself, with all its struggles and triumphs, its questions and discoveries. Jamie's face remained peaceful and concentrated as he played. His eyes were still closed, but Marcus could see that the boy was completely absorbed in the music. He was not thinking about the audition or trying to impress anyone. He was simply sharing something that was important to him, something that had been given to him by someone he loved. As the piece began to move toward its conclusion, Marcus realized that his hands were shaking slightly. He clasped them together and tried to focus on what was happening. In 20 years of conducting auditions, he had never heard anything like this. He had worked with prodigies and geniuses, with students who had won international competitions and played with famous orchestras. But none of them had ever made him feel the way Jamie's playing was making him feel right now. The chaconne was building toward its final statement of the main theme. After all the variations and explorations, Bach brought the music back to where it had started, but with all the wisdom and experience of the journey added to it. Jamie seemed to understand this perfectly. His playing became more intense and focused as he prepared to bring the piece to its end. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, completely forgetting about his professional distance and skeptical attitude. He was no longer listening as a judge or critic. He was listening as someone who loved music and recognized something truly special when he heard it. As Jamie's bow moved across the strings, something extraordinary began to happen in the audition room. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to grow warmer and more golden. The pictures of famous musicians on the walls seemed to lean in closer, as if they too wanted to hear what this young boy was creating with his damaged violin. Marcus felt his entire understanding of music beginning to shift. For 20 years, he had believed that great playing came from expensive instruments, famous teachers, and years of formal training. He had built his career on finding students who had all the advantages that money could buy. But Jamie was proving that everything Marcus thought he knew was wrong. The boy's bow technique was flawless, but that was not what made his playing special. Professional violinists could play with perfect technique. What Jamie was doing went far beyond technique. He was making the violin sing with a voice that seemed to come from his very soul. Each note he played carried emotion and meaning that reached directly into Marcus's heart. Sarah had given up any pretense of taking notes. Her tablet lay forgotten on the table as she listened with complete attention. She had studied music theory and knew how difficult the chaconne was supposed to be. She understood the technical challenges that Jamie was navigating with such ease. But more than that, she could feel the story that the music was telling. It was a story about loss and hope, about struggle and triumph. It was a story about someone who had faced difficult times but had found beauty and meaning in the midst of hardship. Sarah found herself thinking about Jamie's grandmother, the woman who had taught him to play. She could almost imagine an elderly woman sitting with a young boy, sharing not just musical knowledge but life wisdom through the language of violin music. Marcus tried to hold on to his skepticism, but it was slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. He had spent so many years protecting himself from disappointment by expecting the worst from young musicians. It was easier to be pleasantly surprised than to hope for greatness and be let down. But Jamie was not letting him hide behind his walls of doubt. The music moved into a section where Bach had written passages that seemed to require the violinist to play harmony and melody at the same time. Most students struggled with this part because it demanded complete control of the bow and perfect coordination between both hands. Jamie played these passages as if they were the most natural thing in the world. But it was not just the technical mastery that amazed Marcus. It was the way Jamie made musical choices that showed deep understanding of the piece. When the harmony called for emphasis, he brought it out clearly. When the melody needed to soar above everything else, he made it sing. He understood the relationship between all the different musical lines and knew how to balance them perfectly. Marcus found himself leaning forward in his chair, his elbows resting on the table. His pen had rolled away from his hand, forgotten. His evaluation sheet lay blank except for Jamie's name at the top. He was no longer thinking like a judge or a director. He was simply listening like someone who loved music and was witnessing something miraculous. The chaconne continued to unfold, each variation more beautiful than the last. Jamie's playing revealed new layers of meaning in music that Marcus had heard hundreds of times before. It was as if the boy was translating Bach's notes into a language that spoke directly to the human heart. Sarah wiped a tear from her eye and hoped that Marcus would not notice. She had never cried during an audition before, but Jamie's playing was moving her in ways she had not expected. There was something pure and honest about his music that cut through all the pretense and competition of the audition process. He was not trying to prove anything or win anything. He was simply sharing something beautiful. As the piece moved through its most challenging sections, Marcus began to notice details about Jamie's playing that revealed the depth of his training. The boy's vibrato was controlled and expressive. His shifts between positions were smooth and seamless. His double stops were perfectly in tune. These were skills that took years to develop, yet Jamie made them look effortless. But where had he learned these things? Marcus thought about the boy's story about his grandmother. Had an elderly woman really taught him to play at this level? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was right in front of him. Jamie was playing with the skill and understanding of someone who had studied with master teachers for years. The music moved into a section that was written in a minor key, and the mood became darker and more intense. Jamie's playing reflected this change perfectly. His bow pressed deeper into the strings, creating a richer, more powerful sound. The violin seemed to weep and mourn, expressing feelings that were too deep for words. Marcus felt goosebumps rise on his arms. He had heard professional musicians play this section many times, but none of them had ever made him feel the sadness and longing that Jamie was expressing. The boy was not just playing the notes that Bach had written. He was living them, feeling them, and sharing them with everyone in the room. The audition room had become completely silent except for the sound of Jamie's violin. Even the traffic outside seemed to have stopped. The air conditioning system had cycled off and there were no footsteps in the hallway. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath to listen to this young musician. Sarah looked at Marcus and saw that his face had completely changed. The skeptical, challenging expression was gone. In its place was something she had never seen before: wonder. Marcus looked like someone who was witnessing a miracle and could not quite believe what he was seeing. The chaconne moved into its final sections, and Jamie's playing became even more intense and focused. He seemed to understand that the piece was building toward something important, a conclusion that would bring together all the themes and emotions that had come before. His bow moved with complete confidence and his fingers found every note with perfect accuracy. Marcus realized that he had stopped breathing. The music was so beautiful and so powerful that he felt afraid to make any sound that might interrupt it. He watched Jamie's face and saw complete concentration and peace. The boy was not struggling with the difficulty of the music. He was flowing with it, letting it carry him along like a river. As the piece prepared for its final statement, Marcus felt his entire worldview shifting. Everything he had believed about talent and training and musical excellence was being challenged by this 12-year-old boy with a damaged violin. Jamie was proving that real musicianship came from somewhere deeper than expensive instruments or famous teachers. It came from the heart. It came from understanding. It came from a connection to something larger than oneself. Jamie had that connection, and he was sharing it with everyone in the room. Marcus felt privileged to witness it, and he knew that his life was being changed by what he was hearing. The final notes of the chaconne were approaching, and Marcus held his breath as he waited to hear how Jamie would bring this incredible performance to its conclusion. Jamie played the final notes of Bach's chaconne with such tenderness and beauty that the sound seemed to linger in the air, even after his bow had lifted from the strings. The last note faded slowly, like the final rays of sunlight disappearing behind a mountain. Then there was complete silence. The audition room felt different now, as if something sacred had just taken place within its walls. The afternoon light coming through the windows seemed softer and more peaceful. Even the air itself felt changed, charged with the emotion and beauty that Jamie had created with his music. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, staring at the 12-year-old boy who had just given the most incredible musical performance he had ever witnessed. His mouth was slightly open, and he realized that he had been holding his breath for the last several minutes. When he finally exhaled, it came out as a long, shaky sigh. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. She had never experienced anything like what had just happened. In all her years of studying music and working with young musicians, she had never heard playing that moved her so deeply. She looked at Jamie with a mixture of amazement and gratitude, as if he had given her a precious gift. Jamie slowly lowered his violin and opened his eyes. For a moment he looked confused, as if he was returning from a long journey and needed time to remember where he was. Then he saw Marcus and Sarah staring at him, and a look of concern crossed his face. "Was that okay?" he asked quietly. "I know it was longer than 3 minutes. I am sorry if I took too much time." Marcus tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt tight and his hands were actually shaking. He had to clear his throat twice before he could make any sound at all. "Where?" Marcus began, then stopped and cleared his throat again. "Where did you learn to play like that?" His voice was barely above a whisper, completely different from the harsh, challenging tone he had used earlier. Sarah looked at him with surprise. In all the time she had worked with Marcus, she had never heard such awe and respect in his voice. Jamie carefully placed his violin back in its case before answering. He seemed to understand that this was an important moment and wanted to show proper respect for his instrument. "My grandmother taught me," he said simply. "She used to play in concert halls before she came to America. She said that music was the language of the heart, and that if you spoke it honestly, people would understand you no matter where they came from." Marcus leaned forward in his chair. "What was your grandmother's name? Where did she play?" Jamie's face brightened when he talked about his grandmother. "Her name was Li Wei Chen. She played violin in Beijing and Shanghai and other cities in China. But then there was trouble in her country, and she had to leave everything behind and come to America. She brought only her violin and some photographs." "When did she teach you?" Marcus asked, his voice still soft with amazement. "Every day after school," Jamie replied, "and on weekends. She said that music was the one thing that nobody could ever take away from you, no matter what happened in your life. She said that as long as you could make music, you would never be completely alone." Sarah felt fresh tears starting in her eyes as she listened to Jamie talk about his grandmother. She could picture an elderly woman sitting with a young boy, passing on not just musical knowledge but wisdom and hope. "Is she—" Marcus began, then hesitated. He was afraid to ask the question, but he needed to know. "She died last year," Jamie said quietly. "She was sick for a long time, but she kept teaching me until the very end. On her last day, she made me promise that I would never stop playing. She said that her music would live on through me." Marcus felt his eyes filling with tears. Suddenly everything made sense. The maturity in Jamie's playing, the depth of emotion, the perfect understanding of the music, it all came from years of learning not just technique but life itself, from someone who had experienced both joy and sorrow. "This violin," Marcus said, gesturing toward Jamie's case. "It was hers?" Jamie nodded. "She brought it with her from China. It is not very beautiful anymore, but she said that its voice was still strong. She taught me that it does not matter how expensive your instrument is. What matters is how much love you put into your playing." Marcus stood up from his chair and walked around the table. He moved slowly, as if he was still recovering from what he had just experienced. When he reached Jamie, he did something that shocked Sarah completely. Marcus, the demanding director who was known for his high standards and critical nature, got down on one knee so that he was at eye level with the 12-year-old boy. "Jamie," he said, his voice full of emotion, "I owe you an apology. I judged you before you even played a single note. I looked at your clothes and your violin case and decided that you could not possibly have real talent. That was wrong of me. It was unprofessional and frankly it was shameful." Jamie looked confused. "You do not need to apologize, sir. I understand that many students audition for your orchestra. You have to make difficult choices," but Marcus shook his head. "No, you do not understand. What you just did in this room was not just good playing. It was not even just great playing. It was something I have never heard before in 20 years of working with young musicians. You have a gift that goes beyond anything I have encountered in my entire career." Sarah watched this scene with amazement. She had never seen Marcus humble himself before anyone, especially not a child. But Jamie's playing had clearly changed something fundamental in the director's heart. Marcus reached out and gently shook Jamie's hand. "I would be honored to have you in the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra. Not just as a member, but as our featured soloist for our Carnegie Hall performance this spring." Jamie's eyes went wide with surprise. "Really? You mean I passed the audition?" Marcus laughed, and for the first time Sarah could remember, it was a warm, genuine laugh. "Passed, Jamie? You did not just pass. You showed me something I had forgotten about music. You reminded me why I fell in love with it in the first place." Sarah stood up from her chair and joined Marcus and Jamie. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," she said, her voice still thick with emotion. "Thank you for sharing your grandmother's gift with us." Jamie looked back and forth between the two adults, still trying to process what was happening. "So I can really be in the orchestra?" "Not just in it," Marcus said. "I want to arrange for you to have proper instrument restoration for your grandmother's violin. I also want to help you apply for scholarships at the best music schools in the country. Someone with your talent deserves every opportunity we can provide." Jamie's eyes filled with tears of joy and relief. "My grandmother always said that music would open doors for me. I think she would be very happy right now." Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that he had not experienced in years. This boy had not just given an incredible audition. He had reminded Marcus of the real purpose of music education: to nurture and share the human spirit through the universal language of sound and emotion. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice full of certainty. "I think she would be very happy indeed." Marcus stood up from where he had been kneeling beside Jamie and walked back to his chair, but he did not sit down. Instead, he placed both hands on the back of the chair and looked directly at the young boy who had just changed his entire understanding of music and talent. "Jamie," Marcus began, his voice serious but warm, "I need to tell you something important. What I did to you today was not acceptable. When you walked into this room, I made judgments about you based on your appearance and your equipment. I decided you could not be talented before I even heard you play." Jamie started to shake his head as if to say that Marcus did not need to apologize, but Marcus held up his hand gently. "No, please let me finish. In my 20 years as director of this orchestra, I have prided myself on being professional and fair. But today I was neither. I was rude to you. I challenged you in a way that was meant to discourage you, not to help you succeed. I am deeply sorry for that." Sarah watched this exchange with growing respect for her boss. She had never seen Marcus admit he was wrong about anything, let alone apologize so sincerely to a child. But Jamie's performance had clearly shaken him to his core and made him question everything. He thought he knew about finding musical talent. Marcus walked around the table again and extended his hand to Jamie. "Will you accept my apology?" Jamie looked up at Marcus with his serious dark eyes and nodded. "Of course, sir. I understand that you hear many students every day, It must be difficult to know who has real talent. That is exactly the problem, Marcus said as they shook hands. I thought I knew what real talent looked like. I thought it came with expensive instruments and famous teachers and perfect clothes. You have shown me that I was completely wrong. Marcus turned to Sarah. Sarah, please cancel the rest of today's auditions. Call the remaining families and reschedule them for next week. I need time to think about what just happened here. Sarah nodded and began typing on her tablet. She understood that Marcus needed to process the emotional impact of Jamie's performance. In all her time working with him, she had never seen him so moved or so changed by a single audition. Marcus turned back to Jamie. Now let us talk about your future. First, I want you to know that you have definitely earned a place in the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra. But more than that, I would like to offer you the position of featured soloist for our Carnegie Hall performance in 6 months. Jamie's eyes went wide. What does that mean exactly? It means you would perform a solo piece with the full orchestra backing you up. You would be the main performer for one of the most important concerts of the year. Thousands of people would hear you play, including music critics, talent scouts, and representatives from major music schools. Jamie sat down in a chair that Sarah brought over for him. The weight of what Marcus was offering was beginning to sink in. I have never performed with an orchestra before, Jamie said quietly. I have only played by myself or with my grandmother. What if I make mistakes in front of all those people? Marcus smiled warmly. Jamie, after what I just heard, I'm not worried about you making mistakes. But you are right that performing with an orchestra is different from playing alone. That is why I want to arrange for you to have additional coaching and practice sessions. Sarah looked up from her tablet. Should I contact Professor Martinez at the conservatory? She specializes in preparing young soloists for major performances. Yes, excellent idea, Marcus said. And I also want to arrange for Jamie's violin to be properly restored. That instrument clearly has a beautiful voice, but it deserves to be in perfect condition for such an important performance. Jamie looked down at his violin case with concern. How much does that cost? My family does not have very much money. Marcus knelt down beside Jamie's chair. You do not need to worry about money. The orchestra has funds specifically for helping talented young musicians. We will cover the cost of the restoration, the coaching sessions, and anything else you need to prepare for Carnegie Hall. But why would you do all that for me? Jamie asked. You do not even know me. Marcus thought about how to answer that question. How could he explain that Jamie's playing had reminded him of why he had become a music teacher in the first place? How could he describe the way the boy's performance had touched his heart and renewed his faith in the power of music? Because, Marcus said finally, what you have is extremely rare and precious. In 20 years of working with young musicians, I have never heard anyone play with the depth of feeling and understanding that you showed today. It would be a crime to let that talent go undeveloped. Sarah finished making her phone calls and joined the conversation. Marcus is right, Jamie. What you did today was extraordinary. I studied music in college, and I have heard professional violinists who could not play with the emotion and beauty that you just showed us. Jamie looked back and forth between Marcus and Sarah, still trying to process everything that was happening. A few hours ago, he had been nervous about a simple audition. Now he was being offered opportunities he had never dreamed of. Can I ask you something? Jamie said to Marcus. Of course, anything. When you were challenging me earlier, when you were telling me about all the famous schools and expensive instruments, were you trying to make me give up? Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment. Yes, he admitted. I am ashamed to say that I was. I thought you were just another child who was not prepared for a serious audition. I wanted to teach you a lesson about respecting the process. But why did you change your mind? Marcus sat down in a chair facing Jamie. Because your grandmother taught you something that all those expensive schools and famous teachers sometimes forget. She taught you that music is not about showing off or proving how much you know. It is about sharing something real and honest from your heart. Jamie smiled for the first time since entering the audition room. That is exactly what she used to say. She said that technique was important, but feeling was more important. She said that if you played with true feeling, people would forgive small mistakes. But if you played perfectly but without heart, people would forget your music as soon as it ended. Your grandmother was a wise woman, Marcus said, and she was clearly an excellent teacher. You are living proof of her wisdom and skill. Sarah pulled out a calendar and showed it to Marcus. When should we schedule Jamie's first coaching session with Professor Martinez? Marcus looked at Jamie. How does next Saturday morning sound? That would give you a week to get used to the idea of being in the orchestra before we start intensive preparation for Carnegie Hall. Jamie nodded eagerly. That sounds perfect. I cannot wait to learn from a real professor. Marcus laughed. Jamie, after what I heard today, I think Professor Martinez might end up learning as much from you as you learn from her. As they made plans for Jamie's future with the orchestra, Marcus felt a sense of excitement and purpose that he had not experienced in years. This boy was going to remind everyone who heard him play about the true power and beauty of music. And Marcus was going to make sure that Jamie had every opportunity to share his extraordinary gift with the world. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the wings of Carnegie Hall, watching Jamie prepare for the most important performance of his young life. The famous concert hall was packed with nearly 3,000 people, all waiting to hear the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra's spring concert. But tonight was special. Tonight, a 12-year-old boy with a restored violin was going to show the world what his grandmother had taught him about music. Jamie stood quietly beside Marcus, his violin case in his hands. The case was the same one he had brought to his audition, still held together with duct tape. But inside was his grandmother's violin, now restored to its original beauty by one of the best instrument makers in the country. The scratches had been carefully repaired, the varnish had been renewed, and new strings had been installed. But Jamie had insisted on keeping the old case, saying it reminded him of his journey. How do you feel? Marcus asked quietly. Jamie smiled up at him. Nervous but excited. My grandmother always said that a little nervousness was good because it meant you cared about doing well. Marcus nodded. Over the past 6 months, he had gotten to know Jamie well through their weekly coaching sessions. The boy had grown in confidence and skill, but he had never lost the humility and grace that had impressed Marcus from the very beginning. The coaching sessions with Professor Martinez had been remarkable. The distinguished teacher, who had worked with some of the world's most famous violinists, had been skeptical when Marcus first called her. She had agreed to work with Jamie mostly as a favor to Marcus. But after their first session, she had called Marcus in amazement. Where did you find this child? She had asked. He has technique that students twice his age would envy, but more importantly, he has musical understanding that some professional musicians never develop. His grandmother must have been an extraordinary teacher. As the weeks had passed, word about Jamie had spread through the classical music community. Music critics had heard about the young soloist who would be performing at Carnegie Hall. Several had requested interviews, but Marcus had protected Jamie from too much attention, wanting him to focus on his music rather than publicity. The orchestra members had been skeptical at first when Marcus announced that a 12-year-old would be their featured soloist. Many of them were teenagers who had been playing for years and felt they deserved the honor more than a newcomer. But when they heard Jamie play during their first rehearsal together, all their doubts disappeared. Sarah, who had become like a big sister to Jamie over the past months, appeared beside them in the wings. The hall is completely sold out, she whispered. There are music school representatives here from Juilliard, Curtis, and the New England Conservatory. Several professional orchestra conductors are in the audience too. Jamie's eyes widened slightly, but he took a deep breath and nodded. My grandmother always said that it did not matter who was listening. She said that if you played with honesty and love, the music would reach whoever needed to hear it. Marcus felt a familiar warmth in his chest whenever Jamie quoted his grandmother. Over the months, he had learned more about Li Wei Chen and her remarkable life. She had indeed been a respected violinist in China before political troubles forced her to flee to America. She had given up her own career to work in a factory and raise her family. But she had never stopped playing music or believing in its power. The orchestra was already on stage, tuning their instruments and preparing for the concert. Tonight's program would feature several classical pieces, but the highlight would be Jamie's performance of Bach's Chaconne in D minor, the same piece he had played at his audition, but now arranged for full orchestra accompaniment. Marcus had worked for weeks with the orchestra's arranger to create a version that would support and enhance Jamie's solo playing without overwhelming it. The result was a beautiful collaboration between the young soloist and the full ensemble that brought out new dimensions in Bach's masterpiece. Places, everyone, called the stage manager. It was time for the concert to begin. Marcus walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. As conductor and director of the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra, he was well known in the classical music world. But tonight he felt more excited than he had in years. He was about to present something truly special to the world. The first half of the concert went beautifully. The orchestra played pieces by Mozart and Vivaldi with precision and passion. Marcus could feel the audience's appreciation and excitement building, but he knew they were all waiting for the second half, when Jamie would take the stage. During intermission, Marcus returned to the wings to check on Jamie. The boy was sitting quietly, holding his violin and practicing fingering patterns in the air. He looked calm and focused. "Ready?" Marcus asked. Jamie stood up and smiled. "Ready." When the second half began, Marcus walked back onto the stage with Jamie beside him. The audience's applause was warm and encouraging, but Marcus could sense their curiosity. Many of them had never heard of Jamie Chen and wondered what this young boy could possibly offer that would justify featuring him at Carnegie Hall. Marcus raised his baton and looked at Jamie, who had positioned his violin and was waiting for the downbeat. For a moment, Marcus was transported back to that afternoon 6 months ago, when he had been so skeptical and dismissive. How much he had learned since then. How much Jamie had taught him about keeping an open mind and heart. The orchestra began the gentle introduction that led into Jamie's solo entrance. Marcus watched the boy's face and saw complete concentration and peace. Jamie was not thinking about the famous people in the audience or the critics who might review his performance. He was thinking about his grandmother and the music she had taught him to love. When Jamie began to play, the effect on the audience was immediate and profound. The same magic that had transformed the audition room 6 months ago now filled the entire concert hall. People who had been whispering or shifting in their seats became completely still. The music that flowed from Jamie's violin was so pure and beautiful that it seemed to stop time itself. Marcus conducted the orchestra with tears in his eyes as he watched Jamie share his grandmother's gift with 3,000 people. The boy played with the same honesty and emotion that had first amazed Marcus. But now his technique was even more polished and his confidence was complete. When the piece ended, the silence lasted for several seconds before the audience erupted in the longest standing ovation in Carnegie Hall's recent memory. People were crying, cheering, and calling out "Bravo" from every section of the hall. Jamie bowed gracefully, then looked over at Marcus with a smile that seemed to say, "We did it, grandmother. We shared your music with the world." After the concert, Marcus was surrounded by reporters, music school representatives, and fellow conductors, all wanting to know more about Jamie. 3 major conservatories offered him full scholarships on the spot. A famous recording company wanted to discuss making an album. A renowned violin teacher offered to take Jamie as a student. But Marcus made sure that Jamie was not overwhelmed by all the attention. The boy's future would be bright and full of opportunities. But Marcus wanted to make sure that success did not change the humble, graceful young musician he had come to love like a son. Later that evening, as they packed up to leave Carnegie Hall, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since Jamie's audition. The experience had made him a better teacher and a better person. He had instituted new policies for orchestra auditions, making sure that every candidate was treated with respect and given a fair chance, regardless of their background or appearance. Jamie's story had become legendary in the music education community. Marcus was often invited to speak at conferences about the importance of keeping an open mind and looking for talent in unexpected places. He always ended these talks by playing a recording of Jamie's Carnegie Hall performance. And there was never a dry eye in the audience, but most importantly, Jamie had reminded Marcus and everyone who heard him play that music was not about competition or showing off or proving anything to anyone. It was about sharing the deepest parts of the human heart through the universal language of sound and emotion. As they walked out of Carnegie Hall into the New York night, Marcus put his hand on Jamie's shoulder and smiled. "Your grandmother would be very proud of you tonight." Jamie looked up at the stars above the city lights and nodded. "I know she is. I can feel her with me every time I play." Marcus knew that Jamie's journey was just beginning. There would be many more concerts, more opportunities, and more chances to share his extraordinary gift with the world. But tonight had been perfect. Tonight, a young boy had honored his grandmother's memory and reminded everyone who heard him that real talent comes from the heart, not from money or status or expensive equipment. And Marcus Rivera, who had once been a skeptical director who almost missed the greatest musical talent of his career, would never forget the lesson that Jamie Chen had taught him about keeping his mind and heart open to the possibility of miracles.